And we're live. It is Monday, February 17th, the year of our Lord 2025, and I have a little story to tell you all about tiling a bathroom. Yesterday, I went to the cabin in the woods, which, as many of you know, is under reconstruction from the devastating flood that it suffered a couple of years ago. And we have reached the stage, as you all may remember, where I'm doing a lot of it myself. And yesterday, my wife and I went to the cabin to lay a bunch of tiles in the bathroom. And one of the things that you may not know, I didn't know, about tiling a bathroom on the ground floor of a house with no basement is that you have to put a moisture barrier between the tile and the subfloor. And so, and I'm kind of impatient with this stuff because I'm, male and don't like to read instructions. And so I was ready to just go, put the tile in. But my wife, who reads instructions and actually bothers to know things before she does stuff that may affect the structural integrity of our house, says no, we need to get a moisture barrier. So we went to the Lowe's in the little town near the cabin in the woods to get moisture barrier. And guess where the moisture barrier is made? Minna?
Russia?
No.
China?
No. You're thinking too thematically close to the subject of today's. It's made in Canada. And as such, it is subject to a 25% tariff that is currently suspended because, Trump backs down if you go rah to him, which Justin Trudeau did, and he gets spooked. So we have a 30-day pause. So I did not pay the tariff on the 25% tariff on the moisture barrier. And we went back and we did the tiling at the cabin in the woods and everything was cool. But I ask you, should every construction project in the United States that requires a moisture barrier, which is to say every bathroom tiling project, be subject to a 25% tariff? Do you want that?
Sure, to own the libs, anything.
Well, I understand that, Minna, but you live in Sweden, and so you're gonna own the libs for free. But I and Fabian, who lives in Oslo, is going to own the libs for free. But I actually have to pay the goddamn tariff. And I just want to say, as an American taxpayer, I should be able to go to Lowe's, buy my Canadian moisture barrier, and go home, and I shouldn't have a 25% tariff. So here is what I want American businesses to do. When you charge more for something because of the tariff, when it goes into effect, if it ever does, put it on the receipt in big letters. Extra cost because of Trump tariff, right? Put it in. Everything you're raising your prices on, label it. Please, on the receipt, so that people don't have to look at the Made in Canada label on their moisture barriers and figure out that they're probably paying more as a result. Put it on the receipt. All right. You're watching Dog Shirt TV. It is a revolution in morning television. And one of the reasons it's a revolution in morning television is we can go directly from talking about our own home improvement products to arguing with a guest in Norway about whether or not he was present at a special military operation in Norway. And I am informed by Fabian Hoffmann, our guest this morning, that I have misinformed y'all about what happened when he and I had dinner in Oslo a year and a half ago. And look, I'm 55 years old. My memory is clearly starting to go. So, Fabian, re educate me. What did I get wrong? I remember vividly being alone on that street corner in Oslo, but and we definitely cased the place together. So, like, walk me through what happened. When did you abandon me?
Yeah, it was very alone and awkward. You were right about that one. Because I also experienced it. So basically, what happened? We didn't meet for dinner. We just had a drink. And then after
So
the
I'm
drink,
getting everything wrong,
and then
basically.
after the drink, we went to stake out the place, and it was like this weird. I don't know. It was like something like a highway that was behind the embassy, right? And we tried first the
We
bridge if
went
that
up on
would
the
work.
bridge
And then,
to
but we then settled like for right next to the embassy. Then we both went home, or at least I did. But then later, when it was dark, I came back together with my partner, and then we were there. And the thing is, you were absolutely right. It was incredibly empty. Like there was no one. I think like in this whole, I think I was there with my partner for like 30, 45 minutes, maybe an hour. I don't know that part anymore. But literally, there were maybe like 5 cars and maybe like 3 other people that walked by. So it was
but am I
incredibly empty.
when you showed up, was I standing there alone projecting?
Yeah.
Okay, so what my memory is that I was there. It's really one of the very few special military operations that I've done where I was alone and completely isolated. And if the Russians wanted to off me, this was really their chance. And I even have a video where I'm saying this is as a real Jean Le Carré vibe. If they want to get me, this is their chance. And so I'm remembering that and had forgotten that you guys showed up sometime after that. Um, okay, so correction, Fabian did not abandon me. We did not have dinner. Everything I told you was
So I see
wrong.
great
Um,
potential here to
it,
plant memories with you, Ben. I'm gonna start
yes.
testing this.
Well, look,
I'm just gonna start like throwing
I
things
mean,
out to like remember that one time, and then I'll see like at what point you start like repeating those false memories.
look, I'm just one step from Alzheimer's. I'm old. And and I was sleep deprived because I was, you know, in your crazy part of the world with no, without really acclimating to it and doing projections every
Indeed,
few
about
days.
this, I have to tell a story that you probably also have already forgotten, that you came very unprepared with only dog t-shirts, and you had to buy a wolf hoodie because it was cold in Finland.
On a
Yes.
boat. Yeah, there is a ferry. No, that's absolutely true. I wear dog shirts. It's one of the things that I do, as you know. And so and it turns out that evenings in Helsinki are a little chilly, and evenings in Tallinn can be a little chilly. And so on the ferry, but I can't just go buy a Finland shirt because I wear dog shirts. But fortunately, on the ferry from Tallinn to Helsinki, there was dog hoodies or wolf hoodies, and so I have a an excellent. I think it's actually, I don't know if it's a Finnish wolf hoodie or a Estonian wolf hoodie, but it's one or the other. And Folks, we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Fabian Hoffmann, who is a fabulous air power and weapon systems expert from Germany originally, right?
Yeah.
But Norwegian by choice, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, Minna, get us started. What are we talking to Fabian about today, other than not abandoning me at Special Military
So
Operations in
Fabian, I
Oslo?
have lost count of all the op-eds that you have written in the past days. So
Me
you're
too.
gonna have to sort of get us up to date on that. And that could maybe be a good start. I mean, like, little did we know when I asked you to come on the show, like, the plan was actually to have you talk about Trump's unrealistic missile defense plans and the Russian nuclear arsenal. But who cares about those details right now, right? So, I mean, you're free to talk about that too, but like, I believe that you have sort of like more pressing need to vent about something. So this is a safe space to vent. You're free to vent about like whatever you feel like is the most pressing matter right now.
Including lies by the host about,
Oh.
disinformation by the host.
So, um, I was laying in bed yesterday, and I was like trying to reflect on everything that happened, right? And trying to figure out what my emotions are that I'm feeling right now, because it's a bit weird, right? That I along with so many other analysts, Minna included, that it feels like a bit we've been screaming against the wall for 2 years,
Three.
and just nothing has
It's been
happened,
three
right?
years.
Like basically 3 years. Yeah, I think I ramped it up like
Mhm.
2 years ago. Well, at least people started to ask me for my opinion 2 years ago. I think it was a bit longer for you, but basically, right? It's a weird feeling that I have right now, where it's like a mix of acceptance, resignation, fear, anxiety. So there's like a lot
Put
going
in
on when you
anger.
look at the
Anger
the
is a part of the
European.
mix.
What?
Put in anger. Anger is a part of the
Yeah, anger is
mix.
also part of it. So I was thinking about that. I find it really hard to describe it, and then I remembered. I don't know if you guys are Hamilton fans. The musical. Have you listened to it? Watched it?
I have seen it.
Admit my
Not a
ignorance.
particular fan, but
Okay.
I'm
I
admiring
I
of it.
I love it. I love it. I've like watched it several times, and I not live, just on Disney Plus. And I keep listening to the songs. And at the beginning and the end, there's like, basically there's a recurring sentence. In especially in the beginning and in the end in the songs, that keeps coming back. And this is when Hamilton says, "I imagine death so much it feels more like a memory." And this is a bit like I feel how it feels like right now, right? Talking about these issues, thinking about these issues, it's it's depressingly accepting to think about all those worst case scenarios that we might experience in Europe in the coming days. And I don't want to be Debbie Downer, like being all that pessimistic here, but like um we've gotten to the point where where I've said over the last 2 years, look, there are worst case scenarios out there that we have to get prepared for. We didn't get prepared for, and now we're pretty much living in this worst case scenario. And at the same time, there's like this, yeah, there's this sense of anxiety, fear, anger, but also acceptance and resignation in that. Yeah, not sure how you feel about that.
Well, so I mean, I have a you guys have a very particular view of this situation, which is the view of people who have an enormous stake in the foreign policy implications and no particular stake in the domestic implications, other than one of, you know, sympathy and horror and that sort of thing. But, for us, it is the there is a everything everywhere all at once, right? We're trying to manage a very dangerous domestic situation. We're also trying to, we're also experiencing all the dangers of the foreign policy, both on our own behalf and on the behalf of Europeans and Ukrainians in particular. We are also dealing with stuff that you guys have no cause to even think about. For example, um, you know, like, are we overturning 70 years of US policy in the Middle East, which is, fairly like we're not going to annex Gaza, but what are we going to do, right? And we have a similar set of questions that hasn't reared its head particularly yet, but will about the Pacific. Are we going to are we going to let China swallow up Taiwan? Are we going to abandon South Korea and Japan? Right? There's a set of questions that play out. Um, and so one of the things that happens when you deal with all of it at the same time is you deal with none of it quite as acutely as you do if you're, say, a European defense analyst and you are very, very focused on one of them. And so, you end up you end up with a much more general sense of, and like this is, the organization that my wife runs, you know, furloughed half of its people the other day because of the freeze on foreign assistance stuff, right? I mean, this stuff when you live in Washington, this stuff hits very, very close to home, very, very quickly, and so you end up being a little bit unable to focus on the specific areas the way you guys can when kind of only you're aware of all of them, but only one of them is close to your professional
I'd
life.
like to add to this that, like, from a European perspective, like, we all knew that, like, more or less this would happen. We perhaps were like giving Trump too much credit, like in that nobody maybe expected him to literally just like give up all his bargaining chips like up front before the negotiations even start. So that was maybe like a negative surprise in this. But I would say that, like, from a European perspective as well, it has been this looming prospect given the project 2025 and everything we knew about like what Trump aims to do domestically, and then seeing in the first week and 2 weeks of this administration the flurry of like this like flooding the zone tactic of like insane things happening, especially how like Musk was able to like grab the power and like seems to be doing basically pretty much whatever he wants, and like is sort of um, single-handedly just like destroying American federal bureaucracy. So that is actually,
Not
well, yeah, he
single-handedly.
has his little helpers.
Well, he has his little helpers, but he also has authority from the
Yes.
president. And, Musk is, we like to think of him as a kind of all-powerful Rasputin figure because he's worth some number of hundreds of billions of dollars. But his money is not what's empowering him right now. What's empowering him right now is the fact that Trump wants him to be
Yeah.
doing this.
And that has
And
been a
so,
surprise, by the
it
way.
is,
Like, I didn't think that he would last this long even and get to do all of this, but yeah.
well, I mean, and that's where his money comes in, right? He's not like other Trump aides. Trump perceives that he needs him in some important respect. So, look, there have been aspects of it that surprise everybody. I did not expect USAID to be a particular focus of, of thing. The aggregate of it is not surprising at all. It's exactly what Donald Trump promised through an entire campaign. Anybody who didn't expect this in some aggregate sense, right? There's nothing he's done on Ukraine or Europe that he hasn't telegraphed 1,000 times, both during the prior administration and during the campaign. Anybody who was not expecting this, and again, details are details, I wasn't expecting the ferocity of the war on the bureaucracy this quickly. but I was, but anybody who wasn't expecting it because they weren't
Yeah, but
listening. And that includes most Americans, and it also includes a lot of
yeah,
Europeans.
but I would say that so my point was that it's not that we're not incredibly concerned about what he's doing domestically. I personally was saying and still think that is really one of the greatest risks about this administration, what they are going to do in the US domestically. And this is going to impact everything, also in the transatlantic relationship, the US ability even to still fulfill this kind of global role that it has had and all that. So I wouldn't say that we in Europe aren't as worried about what's happening. Obviously, well, actually, because of this whole situation with US aid, a lot of Europeans are also directly hit by it. But
No, I don't mean to criticize Europeans for this. I just mean you guys are naturally focused on this particular aspect of it. It's not without an awareness of the rest. The thing about being in Washington is you end up having to focus on all of it. And so you end up really focused on none of it. And so I actually think it's really good that we have, people like you guys who are laser focused on this aspect of it, people like the Ukrainian community that are laser focused on, US Ukraine relations, people who are really only focused on the domestic side. There's a certain degree of the specialization that's really, really important. I run lawfare, so I get to say, I'm not going to focus on the, domestic healthcare side of it because that doesn't involve security, right? Except in the most diffuse sense. I get to say I'm not going to, I don't work on DEI issues, so I'm going to leave that to other people. But the range of security issues that I need to focus on is such that I actually can't focus well on any of them. And so the specialization is actually really important, I
But there
think.
definitely is also this sense that they have a much more clear domestic agenda, and foreign policy sort of seems to be a lot of sort of not very well prepared positions and sort of poking here and there without much of a plan. That's how it seems. So it's in that sense also interesting to see to what extent Europeans can also play this to their advantage. But I think that let's let Fabian also talk, because I think he's a bit more pessimistic about what's the likelihood of Europeans doing anything. I've read a lot of good news today from the Nordic region about Finland, Norway, Sweden, and in the wider Northern European region, also the Dutch having joined the Brits in saying that they would be ready to contribute in some way to this European ceasefire force. So there is movement there, and there's this Paris meeting now, interestingly including also Denmark as a representative of not only the Nordics but also the Baltics, so the wider region here. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics in Europe going right now that have been sort of triggered by this. Well, I'm not going to use any adjectives to describe the speech that Vance gave, but
let's just call it the Nakba.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics, but yeah, Fabian, why don't you just walk us through some of your worst case scenarios? That's going to be fun.
Yeah. So what I was thinking about, right, with in the end, whether or not we deploy a force there or not as Europeans, which, let's be honest, there is a really good chance we have to do. I think talking that through right now is fairly easy when it's still hypothetical. And you're right, states are moving in that direction, and it seems to be that there is a growing sense that this becomes necessary. But we also have to be 100% clear that once European forces are in there, and especially when the United States has very explicitly stated that these forces will not be covered by NATO Article 5, meaning the Europeans are in there alone, I think there is virtually no chance that Russia will not test us Europeans in some traumatic way. So I think the moment we go in there, right, and this is not to say we shouldn't do that. I think there are very, very good arguments why we have to do that at one point, or very likely have to do that. But if we do that, let's be, 100% upfront and honest. There is a very good chance. I'm not going to attach a percentage number, right? Because I don't have a crystal ball in front of me. But there is a very clear possibility, likelihood, chance, however you want to call it, that this is going to end up in a shooting war with Russia. Right? Because the United States, because the US is out, Russia is going to test European resolve directly in Ukraine. Don't know exactly how. They could be launching a couple of drones or artillery grenades at European forces stationed there. They could also make up, how they have done in the past, like some scenario where reportedly they've been attacked by the mean Europeans and now they're going to launch back. And they're going to launch back some missiles at European cities.
Just for his historical, that's how the invasion of Poland happened in 1939.
I mean, let's quickly zoom out. I mean, the ultimate goal for Russia is not to draw in Europe in order to then conquer the Baltics or something like that, right? That's not a scenario that's realistic. We're never going to see Russia march from Tallinn to Lisbon, something like that, right? That's never going to happen. The ultimate goal of Putin in the next step after Ukraine is to get rid of that pesky NATO, whatever is left of it, once and for all, because then he has free reign over what he perceives as his rightful sphere of influence. And so the best way to do that, right, is test NATO's resolve, either in Ukraine or outside of it. And we just have to be absolutely and 100% prepared that if the Russians are going to test us, which, again, most likely they're going to do that, either directly in Ukraine or they're going to launch some missile strikes against European cities, I think that's fairly likely also, that we're totally prepared to respond and, if need be, also to strike back, right? If the Caliber flies towards Berlin, the Taurus has to fly towards Moscow. There can be no discussion, there can be no debate. That has to be an automaticity, basically, in stone, right the moment that we go into Ukraine. And here's the thing again, right? I'm not exactly sure if the Europeans are there. I think there is a very good chance that right now they're just going to do this talk. And I really hope it's more than that. But I'm still not convinced that the Europeans have grasped the level of resolve that is needed, right? It's super difficult, of course, to generalize across all European NATO states. There are shining examples. But by and large, I remain quite pessimistic.
So I agree with you there in the sense that what the US did with this statement that there would be no US troops on the ground. I mean, if there's that has been sort of the idea all along, since Trump was elected. And I think that what the Europeans have been preparing for would be okay, it would be some kind of a European force, but with the US backstop, air support and whatnot. But this statement up front that this will not be covered by NATO Article 5 and this cannot be sort of made into a NATO mission, which is probably what the Europeans had been thinking until now, that they could maybe go in as a coalition of the willing, which would then be made official NATO mission. And if this is completely off the table, this is America sort of serving us on a silver plate to Russia, just like Fabian says. There's no doubt about that. And then the question is, just like Fabian asked, can European NATO still do something about this, if the US is out? Because obviously the whole point of NATO has been the extended US deterrence, and the US basically canceled that by saying that this will not be covered. Because then the question is if a war between European countries and Russia, as Fabian was just describing, results from this ceasefire monitoring force or whatever it will be called, then and if then the US says no, this still doesn't Article 5 still doesn't apply because it was a result of this constellation, then for sure NATO doesn't exist anymore in the way that it has.
Okay, so I want to break down Fabian's narrative of the situation because it is contingent on a number of things. The first is, can Trump and Putin reach an agreement that Ukraine will, in some sense, honor or be part of that would invite this European force in the first place? And I gotta say, I'm a little skeptical of that. That it seems to me the predicate for your entire scenario is that Trump and Putin can reach an agreement that gets forced down Zelensky's throat. And first of all, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that the Ukrainian position is so weak as to be uh, uh, as vulnerable to that in the short term as both Trump and Putin seem to think. But secondly, it does raise an intervening European uh, security question, which is, can Europe keep Ukraine in the fight without US help so that Ukraine does not have to buckle to that extortion in the first place? And so I guess my question is, before we get to the European deployment and how Russia tests it, how ready is Europe to step up support for Ukraine to compensate for US abandonment of the field if that's what ends up
So
happening?
just like a quick note on this, because I think that one of the interesting things here is that what I read from military analysts who really look at the battlefield situation and follow it very closely, they are saying that it's actually like the tide is turning for Russia. So like it's actually starting to go pretty well for Ukraine at the moment again. Russia is struggling.
The Pokrovsk offensive appears to be failing.
Yeah, and like I mean the whole like Kursk situation is like still very interesting. It was a good move by Ukraine, and like there would be so much potential here for Ukraine to actually, like, if we kept it going for a little longer, to find itself in actually a stronger position than Russia. So that's why this timing is also very interesting. That it sort of
Right.
looks like Trump is trying to save Putin's ass here.
So right, but this also just begs my question. Like, we've been arming Ukraine to the hilt, both as the United States and as the Western alliance more generally over a long period of time. The Russians have burned through 700,000 people. Um, you know, yes, there are manpower shortages on the Ukrainian side, but it does not. I don't know that I believe that if you turn off American support and say, okay, now we're reaching a deal with Putin, that the Ukrainian forces don't collapse
No.
immediately as a result of it, and Europe can play an enormous role in putting Ukraine in the position of resisting that deal, which we are going to shamefully try to push down their throats. And so my question, Fabian, is
Yeah.
to what extent is, you're describing European unpreparedness for the second phase, but I'm talking about European preparedness for right freaking now. And how good or bad is that picture looking?
So I think first of all, I think one thing we have to realize is that in this war will not end victoriously or in defeat for either side, because either side is going to fully run out of steam, fully lose the ability to resist on the battlefield, right? The outcome of this war, or especially when the war will end, will inherently be a political decision, right? Ukraine can, without the United
Wait,
States,
I just want to
continue to
amplify that point for a second.
Yes,
This is
yes,
a
I'm gonna
really,
amplify it.
really
Don't worry. Let me
important
talk.
point.
So
That there's a burnout factor that's going on both sides right now, that involves weapons, but particularly people. The
yeah,
Russians are borrowing people from North Korea. The Ukrainians are having a very wrenching discussion about enlistment and so this war is not going to end in a agreement, but wind down as a result of attrition on both
but
sides.
we don't know exactly how it's gonna end. But I
Right.
don't believe it's gonna end by one side completely running out of steam. I think that's not realistic, right? I think there are scenarios, and I fully agree with both of you, that Russia is absolutely running down a timer, right? They know that from now on, it's not going to get better. They're losing access to the deep Soviet reserves, and they have also been struggling with manpower issues. That being said, I think they can also still stay in the fight for quite a while. The same way that Ukraine can. Without the United States, by the way, also without Europe. Like, if we completely cut off Ukraine tomorrow from all foreign aid, it's not like that immediately everything would collapse and Russia would run through to Kiev. That would absolutely not gonna happen. So basically, when this war will end, let's say, if Ukraine wants to end this war, the most likely scenario is that at one point they say the costs of continued resistance are going to outweigh the costs of the peace settlement that is going to be imposed on them. And the same, of course, counts for Russia, right? So I think this is, in the end, this is going to come down to a political decision of decision makers when they believe the cost-benefit analysis is skewed in a way that continuing to fight is not going to be better than giving in to what the other side wants. And we don't know exactly when this is going to happen. And I fully agree with you again that we have still in Europe alone has all the means to keep Ukraine in the fight, to assist them so that they can beneficially, right, work with this cost-benefit analysis to get the maximum out of continuing the fight.
Okay, so now go to, we agree on the premise.
Yeah.
What is Europe's, you just said Europe has the capacity to do that. What is Europe's emotional and political capacity to do that?
Yeah. So that's what it comes down to. Materially, we can do it. The question is if we want to. I mean, to be honest, there are some areas where it would be difficult for Europe to step in and fill American support that was lost. One good example is ballistic missile defense. There's just not a lot coming from European suppliers, even if they ramp up production. So, if at one point Patriot missiles, especially those optimized for ballistic missile defense, are not delivered anymore from the United States, then they would become a lot more vulnerable to Russian ballistic missile strikes. That's a reality. But I think for most areas materially, Europe can compensate quite well. Better in some areas than in others, but by and large, Europe can make sure that Ukraine stays in the fight.
Europe can produce as many artillery shells as it wants.
Yeah, exactly. And the question then is if we want to do it, right? Because if we want to, I mean, right now, Europe would still struggle. And they will struggle for as long as they do not ramp up their industrial production. And an interesting thing that we've been seeing, I think, over the last couple of months is that industry has starting to ramp up, but interestingly, only really in areas where large upfront investments are not needed, meaning that could be fulfilled. Like these upfront investments, they could be made by the manufacturers themselves. So basically what we in Europe are waiting for is for governments, maybe also the EU, but probably governments are more realistic, to step in and directly finance the expansion of those capital-intensive industries. Because that's what we haven't seen so far, but that is what is needed to get both Ukraine to where it needs to be, but also get us up to speed defensively.
And is this fundamentally a German problem, or is it a more pan-European problem?
It's broader. I had a really interesting discussion yesterday with Colby Budwar, also an analyst, Canadian analyst. And he basically made the argument that, compared to the United States, European defense manufacturers, they are to a significantly larger degree state-owned. I mean, by and large, they're also majority private, but most governments, at least within their defense primes, they maintain a significant share. They own a significant share of that. So, right, it would be actually quite more logical and also easier for European governments to step in and provide significant amounts of funding to increase production. However, we're not seeing that. Not in Germany, not in France, not in Italy, not in Spain. It's not just a German issue. Whereas in the United States, where you have Lockheed Martin, you have Raytheon, you have Northrop Grumman, L3Harris, all of those, which are fully privately owned, and yet you get the DoD constantly giving them hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to simply expand production, right? Not just for contracts for the product, But for example, Williams International, a turbofan engine manufacturer, received just last December $260 million to expand turbofan production so that it can better support the production of JASSM cruise missiles. And that's without any orders,
You
right?
might
That's
even
just for
call it
production.
a military industrial complex.
Yeah.
So I have to add
exactly.
some sort of like nuance to this, because that's definitely, like, Fabian is not wrong about any of this, but there's different examples as well. So we have this example of, for example, Germany, where it was now rumored in the news that that actually there is that European countries have agreed on a new aid package for Ukraine, military aid package, but it's not going to be published until after the German elections in a week's time. Because the current German chancellor is so afraid of, like, potentially that becoming like an issue in the last week of election campaigning. So this shows you, like, in what a mess Germany finds itself in, that it's not only about, like, indecisive political leadership, which has been the issue constantly the past 3 years, but that at this point, and very likely as partially a result of this indecisive leadership, now the issue is actually the voters, who are very willing to, like, vote for pro-Russian parties, or like this, like, vaguely populist Sarah Wagenknecht party, which is luckily now losing a lot in the polls. But anyway, so this is like, this is Germany. It's very dire. It's very depressing and frustrating. On the other hand,
And just to be clear on the German example, when German coalition negotiations take weeks and weeks or months, and so when you say you're not going to announce something until after the election and you're contemplating a change of government, that could mean a much longer delay
no,
than
I
a
don't think.
week,
I think
right,
it's only
Minna?
about, like, the publication, or like making it public. I don't think that it's necessarily about, like, when Ukraine will get that aid or whatever. And I think that they're just waiting until after the polls close, so that it doesn't affect,
I see.
like,
Okay.
people's voting decisions. But, like, I mean, this is inherently an issue, that being anti-Ukraine actually helps you in polls in Germany, which is, like, really, like, it's so depressing. I can't even.
Which is true. I mean, look, that's part of the
Yeah,
American
but look,
landscape now
Germany is
too.
supposed to be aligned with Northern Europe, right? So this is like a really big issue for us in Northern Europe, for example. But so then I wanted to just, like, bring some other nuance to this, and like some positive caveats. And that is that, for example, the EU has this ingeniously named fund called ASAP, Act in Support of Ammunition Production, that has boosted ammunition production pretty massively in many European countries, among them also Germany. Rheinmetall got a lot of money from them. All that money has been already, it was actually a very fast process. So this was actually ASAP. So that was pretty impressive. The Finnish, Norwegian and Swedish joint ventures got a lot of funding from there. And so the issue was just, for example, in the Nordic countries, that we literally had to go from manufacturing to an industrial production. And that is the thing that, like, is taking longer time. So now they have people working, like, 24/7, like, literally in like a 5-shift rhythm, like, nonstop, to produce shells for Ukraine. And the Nordic countries have really ramped up that production for Ukraine, like, really massive, like, artillery shells, exactly the stuff that they need right now. And like, one part of it, of course, goes also into the regional stockpiles. But then, like, this industrialization process of that manufacturing that is currently happening, that's going to take a couple of years longer. So there has been that, like, EU money that has been very important, for example, for these companies to be able to start investing, absent of, like, maybe like 100% secure, like, government orders or something. And then, like, I know that Finland is more the outlier, but I just want to give this example because, like, this is something that would be actually a smart thing to do. As I understand, the UK is to an extent doing something similar, not on the industrial level, but with other things. But in Finland, we have this system where the Finnish Defence Forces have contracts with a number of civilian companies, and the Finnish Defence Forces are paying for extra production capacity that they have to keep up on the side. And then they would activate it in a case of war when the Finnish Defence Forces would need this production capacity, and they would start producing for the Finnish Defence Forces. So this is, for example, something that exists in Finland, and this has been tested now over the course of the past year. So there were several like logistics exercises in Finland to check whether this capacity is at a sufficient level, or does it need to be expanded, and so on, whether it actually works the way it's intended, and so on. So this exists in some countries. And I would also like to just add, in terms of like what you look at, I think what is very important here, and especially also what the US administration probably is blissfully ignorant of, is that Ukraine's place in Europe has really changed in the past 3 years. So if in 2014 many people were sort of like unsure what this Ukraine is and like what it has to do with us, I think that has changed pretty massively. I think that many Europeans now consider Ukraine like a self-evident part of Europe. It's not going to be as easy to sell out Ukraine in the same way as it was maybe 10 years ago. And then like, because like a lot of countries have also really made like pretty long-term investment in Ukraine. All the Nordic countries have some form of, okay, Finland doesn't publish this, so in Finland there's no like public sort of like long-term financial plan, but the other Nordic countries have a long-term financial plan how to support Ukraine until like 2030 or something for now, which have been constantly being ramped up. There's like a number of like joint ventures between like Nordic and Ukrainian defense companies that are now producing like really tailor-made kit for Ukraine, such as like mini missiles, like mini anti-drone missiles. It's an Estonian startup that's doing that. Finland is starting drone production. Finnish company is starting drone production for Ukrainian needs in Finland this year. So there's a lot of these things going on. So I think that also signals a certain kind of like commitment to like Ukraine's long-term existence. That. Yeah.
All right, so Fabian, why is Minna being overly optimistic here?
So on the ASAP program, right, which is really the shining example of the EU stepping in and providing funding, two problems with that. First, it was 500 million euros. 500 million from the entire EU to all of its member states. That's not the scale we need. That should have been 10 times. The United States alone has invested $7 billion into its defense industrial base in artillery shell production alone. And the European Union could muster 500 million. Now, you are completely right, Ben?
Just to be clear about that, the EU is, as an aggregate, is a larger economy than the United States.
Yeah.
What should the level, realistically, what should the level of EU support be looking at like?
I think that's difficult for me to answer, because what I want our decision makers to do, right? It's the same when it comes to like, how much of GDP should we spend? I think don't ask me that. Ask the generals what they need. If it comes to like how much should we invest in our defense industrial base, talk to the CEOs, talk to the people who work with those companies, ask them what they need, and then we can see what we can make happen. I think those 500 million, just a ballpark number, I think we could have 10x that easily, and we should have 10x it, right? That doesn't mean it wasn't a great program. It was, and luckily, right, that's a good thing, because Ben, you mentioned it, right, that the EU produces more artillery shells than the United States. They ramped up faster. I mean, that's testimony to also the dedication of those manufacturers and the speed at which things can also happen in slow bureaucratic Europe if there is urgency and if there is desire. So that's great, right? I just think the scale, we have not reached the scale in Europe that we need, and we're actually quite far away from that. And then the other slight problem is what I've with Minna's argument is, the same way you have to filter out Norway when it comes to finances and economics from European statistics, I'd say you have to filter out Finland from Europe when it comes to defense statistics.
Wait, explain that statement in both forms for Americans who are not familiar with EU and European political outliers.
So I mean, Norway, right, is an incredibly oil and gas rich country. And if you compare Norway's average GDP per capita, and a couple other key economic indicators, then you basically have to filter them out, because they will immediately skew all the averages for the rest of Europe and make them completely unrepresentative of actual numbers, right? Let's say someone from like the regular life of someone from Romania or Estonia is totally different right, in numbers than that of an average Norwegian, and so you have to just filter them
Let's
out
put
because
it this
otherwise
way,
it's not
Norway could
representative
just pay
anymore.
off Finland's sovereign debt and not even notice.
Yeah, kind of like
They
that.
have like
And
300,000 euros per person. Yeah,
Yeah, Norway is basically the United Arab
of the
Emirates of
Northern Europe.
Europe.
Yeah.
And you know, Finland, I mean, Minna can explain that a lot better than I do, but you know, Finland has been the one shining star in Europe, the one country that did not stop getting prepared for war, did not completely underinvest after the Cold War into defense equipment and necessary resources. And also they have had this just a totally different understanding about what is needed on a societal level to be prepared for worst case contingencies, including war. And that's just something that is not the case for most of Europe.
So this is something that Americans really, really don't understand. And I just want to take a moment to address the American sensibility about this, because the United States has the advantage of being a relatively unitary actor in defense preparedness. We don't have the situation where, you know, Connecticut is highly prepared, but Hawaii perceives, you know, gosh, the Pacific Ocean is really big, so we don't need to, we don't, you know, we thrash that out when we elect a president, and the president and the Congress make decisions for the entire country. And so you end up with a real advantage in the ability to make decisions about things like defense. The flip side of that is that you don't have these test cases where, you know, Finland makes strategic investments in defense over a very long period of time, and acts as a model. Estonia ramps up defense capacity in a way that the rest of Europe notices and maybe has to emulate at some point. And of course, Norway is a bottomless fund of, and these are diversities that matter a great deal in the European context, and have no analog in the United States except at the domestic level.
I just have to like really quickly tell a funny anecdote about like this sort of Finnish like outlier case in which basically you could say that the Cold War never ended for Finland, and we never really like believed in this peace dividend. And like in Finland, we like to joke that for us the peace dividend was that kit was cheap and secondhand shopping was great, because like Finland actually kept up its defense capability for a ridiculously low amount of money. Like we were also floundering somewhere around like 1.3 or 4% of GDP like around the 2010s, because we bought a lot of tanks from Germany and the Netherlands when they thought that they don't need any tanks anymore. Also thanks to the US sort of like crisis management, expeditionary warfare doctrine that was introduced into NATO as well. So that was basically also what the US like encouraged the European allies to do in NATO. And yeah, so we bought tanks from Germany in the early 2000s for less than $1 million a piece. It's like insane when you think about it now. And like the MLRS that are now being upgraded, and the multiple rocket launchers that are now being upgraded are still like in great shape. Finland bought from the Netherlands like for like couple hundred millions. So that was basically how Finland was able to keep up the defense spending, defense capability without spending actually significantly more than other European countries.
Super interesting. Okay, so Fabian, we have 6 minutes, and I want you to outline for us in that time the short-term things to watch. What if Minna's optimism is right, what will the world look like over the next 6 to 8 weeks? And if your pessimism is right, what will the world look like over the next 6 to 8 weeks?
I think 6 to 8 weeks is an incredibly short time frame. I think two
Make it
things.
6 to 8 months.
Yeah, maybe that's better. I mean, maybe what to look out for, right? Again, we're dealing with a material dimension and a cognitive dimension, right? We're dealing with the ability to deter and fight a war if need be, while also dealing with this issue of being a resolved actor, signaling, displaying to Russia and the world that we are steadfast, we're not willing to give in, we have our interests, and we're willing to push our interests through if need be with military force. So those are just the two dimensions that I'm looking at, right? And if the optimistic scenario kicks in, then I think we will now finally see European industries being ramped up. We will see governments stepping in to a greater extent, either by directly supporting the ramp up or offering their industries, long-term, multi-year contracts, so they have planning and investment security. That would happen. And then on the resolve side, I mean, that's really how our decision makers behave. Looking at Germany, right? Will the old government, the new government, behave like the old, where we constantly emphasize that we're afraid of Russia, or is the new German government going to signal to Russia that we are steadfast, that we're willing to confront them, we're not gonna give in. We see the risks of a Ukrainian defeat outweighing the risks of fighting Russia. Right, that would be a direct pointer, and then of course this also translates to the rest of Europe, right? Again, I think the Finns doing it right on both dimensions, but I'm looking at others. I'm looking at the Norwegians. I'm also looking at the Swedes, right? The Swedes were also, I mean, outside of NATO throughout the Cold War and only very recently entered. And they've also always been mentioned a bit as this, also an example of a European country that has been more prepared for war. I mean, even for them, right? Sweden has a very substantial defense industry, but even for them, the ramp up of that industry hasn't really occurred, right? I think the Swedes do a lot of things better than the Germans or the French do, but also them are lacking behind massively, I think, the Finns. And that's also the case for the Norwegians, right? The Norwegians, again, they have the lucky position that they can throw money at a problem, and often that makes it disappear to some extent.
But they can't throw people at a problem.
Yeah, they also haven't fully grasped, right, like the cognitive changes that need to happen. I think that's just something that Europe is lacking behind. So yeah, I'm watching those two dimensions, and I think in the coming 6 to 8 months we will see where it goes.
My advice to all of Europe: don't fixate on Trump's statements.
No.
It's the great strategic posture of the Trump administration on all issues is and has always been talk out of your ass and see what happens. And the error of taking a few speeches around the Munich Security Conference at face value, I don't know whether the policy will end up being better or worse. But the fact that Pete Hegseth and J.D. Vance said some things, and Trump, had a conversation with Putin by phone and waxed non-eloquent about it, actually means very little, except that their intentions are malevolent, which we already knew. So don't take anything they say too seriously. They are, at the end of the day, senile old fools, and in some cases senile young fools. And Pete Hegseth was probably drunk and more interested in the flight attendants on his flight to Munich than in the substance of what anything was going to be said
I just want to say, yeah, like if I may, like in the last minute, like I still think that it was a miscalculation to go to Munich of all places and try to cater to the European far right parties, because like this is again something, like one of the many things that this administration doesn't understand is European coalition politics. They don't understand that they are catering to 20 to 25% of the electorate in any given country at best, because this is where these parties are polling, and that leaves like a very sizable majority that was simply just pissed about this.
Cara mia, don't ever think that I am apologizing for them or making excuses for them or suggesting that it is anything other than appalling and, as you say, a mistake. It's not a mistake. It's an intentionally malevolent behavior. My point about it is merely that they are completely incompetent, and that means that they are also incompetent at the evil that they try to do.
Amen.
And they are not, the malevolence is always tempered by incompetence, and that they say one thing one day and do a different thing the next day, and they experience that without any cognitive dissonance. And by the way, they enjoy the horror that Europeans express. And so the worst thing people in Munich could have done to J.D. Vance was to clap politely, and to not be. He wanted the hysterical response. He got it. That's the game they've been playing domestically for 8 years, and we need to, both domestically and internationally, respond to them with the intellectual respect they deserve, which is to say, none. And that means not taking their bait as quite as easily as we reflexively do when we assume that words have meaning. The following words have meaning. We're going to be back tomorrow, but there's going to be a little catch to it, which is that I am going to be on my way to an airport. And so I am going to be joining by phone. I've never done this before. It's going to be a little complicated. But we're going to be back tomorrow at the usual time. I just might be in an Uber. Fabian Hoffmann, you're a great Norwegian, German, whatever you are. Minna Ålander, you're a great displaced Finn. And it's great to see you both. And Fabian, in apology for misrepresenting your presence at the
misrepresenting my resolve to
your
to be
resolve
anti-Russia,
to confront Russia. Tonight's special military operation will be dedicated to you. And if that sounds like an announcement that there's going to be a special military operation tonight, it is. But it won't be at the usual place. And I'm just going to leave that dangling there. And tune in. I'll probably live stream it on Substack. See you later, guys.
Bye.